She looked like she'd been branded like cattle, but what Colton saw burned into her forehead wasn't just any mark. It was a code, a cipher that whispered of unimaginable cruelty and a trade in human lives that thrived in the shadows of the territory. The sun, a relentless eye in the vast sky, beat down on Colton Reeves as he guided his weary horse through the jagged teeth of the canyon. 3 days he'd been on this trail, tracking lost cattle, but the sign he followed now was different, more sinister. It wasn't the cloven hoof of a stray, but the almost imperceptible drag of a human foot, leading him further into the unforgiving badlands than he'd ever dared venture. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of his horse's hooves against the parched earth and the haunting cry of a lone hawk circling high above, a silent sentinel of the desolate landscape. Then he heard it. A sound that shredded the silence, a fragile whimper, barely a breath, carried on the wind. Colton reined in his horse, his senses on high alert. Years spent wrestling a living from the land had taught him that unnatural sounds in isolated places were rarely innocent. His calloused hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle. At 35, he'd learned that curiosity could be a death sentence, but some sounds couldn't be ignored. Dismounting with practiced ease, he moved cautiously toward a jumble of rocks where the sound seemed to originate, his boots crunching on the dry, unforgiving earth. What he found there was an image that would forever be etched into his memory. A young woman, barely 18, huddled like a terrified animal behind a massive boulder. Her jet-black hair, once undoubtedly beautiful, was now matted with blood and grime, her clothes ripped and stained with the dust of the trail. But it wasn't her physical state that sent a wave of icy dread through Colton's veins. It was the mark. Burned into her forehead, just above her delicate eyebrows, was a series of stark black lines, vertical bars of varying thickness. A barcode. Deliberate. Precise. Someone had branded this girl like livestock. Her dark, haunted eyes met his, and Colton saw a depth of terror he had never encountered before. A fear so profound it seemed to have extinguished the very spark of her spirit. She flinched, attempting to retreat further into the meager shelter of the rocks, her small hands clawing at the unforgiving stone. But there was nowhere left to run. "Easy there," Colton said softly, his voice a low rumble, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, only continued to stare at him with those eyes that held the echoes of unspeakable horrors. Her lips moved silently, forming words in a language he didn't recognize. Chinese, perhaps. He'd heard fragments of it in some of the bustling mining towns, but never like this. Never with such desperate, broken urgency. Colton had always made it a point to mind his own business. But looking at this girl, at the deliberate cruelty of that brand searing her skin, something primal within him snapped. The man he was, the man who valued his own safety above all else, crumbled into dust. Whatever had been done to her, whoever was responsible for this atrocity had crossed a line that defined the very essence of humanity. With deliberate slowness, he reached for his water canteen, moving with the gentle patience he'd used to calm a skittish colt. "You're hurt," he said, even though he doubted she understood his words. "Let me help." The girl's gaze darted past him, scanning the canyon walls with frantic intensity. She was listening for something, or someone, and the way her entire body tensed at every subtle sound told Colton that whatever she feared was very real and very close. Then he heard it, the distant thunder of approaching horses. Multiple riders, moving with relentless speed, their voices carrying on the wind. The girl heard it too, and the sheer, unadulterated terror that washed over her face told Colton everything he needed to know. These weren't rescuers, they were hunters, and they were coming for her. The girl tried to stand, but collapsed immediately, her leg giving way beneath her. She looked up at Colton with desperate eyes, her small hands pressed together in a gesture of pleading that transcended language. She was begging him to save her from whatever was barreling down that canyon, but Colton had no idea what he was about to face, or how deeply he would be drawn into her nightmare. The riders materialized at the canyon's mouth like vultures descending on carrion. 3 men on horseback, their faces etched with hard lines and weathered by the sun, but not from honest labor. These were the kind of men Colton had learned to avoid in dimly lit saloons, the kind who derived pleasure from the suffering of others. The man in the center, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, exuded an arrogance that spoke of a life lived without consequence, where fear was his currency. His coat was of fine wool, his boots impeccably polished, but his eyes held a glacial coldness that made Colton's skin crawl. A jagged scar bisected his face, running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and when he smiled, it resembled a wound perpetually struggling to heal. "Well, well," the man called out, his voice laced with the polished accent of someone educated back east. "What do we have here?" Colton moved protectively in front of the girl, keeping his hand close to his sidearm, but making no move to draw it. "Just passing through," he said, his voice even and controlled. "Looking for strays." The scarred man's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed a shade too sharp. "Funny thing about strays," he said, dismounting with a fluid grace that hinted at underlying danger. "Sometimes they belong to someone. Sometimes they're worth a considerable sum when returned to their rightful owner." "This girl doesn't belong to anyone," Colton replied, his voice hardening. "Oh, but she does." The man reached inside his coat and produced a leather folder. He opened it to reveal what appeared to be ownership papers, meticulously detailed documentation with precise measurements, physical descriptions, and at the bottom, a drawing of the exact barcode pattern burned into the girl's forehead. "Property of Morrison Enterprises, catalog number 47. She's quite valuable, actually. Took considerable effort to customize her for her intended purpose. Morrison." The name echoed in Colton's mind like a chilling premonition. He'd heard whispers of the name in hushed tones in distant towns, always spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. Victor Morrison, they called him. The brand, a man who dealt in human lives as others dealt in cattle or grain. "She's hurt," Colton said, struggling to maintain his composure. "Needs medical attention," Victor laughed, the sound grating like glass against stone. "She's hurt because she ran. Cost me 3 days of tracking and considerable expense. But don't worry, I'll take excellent care of her once she's broken properly." The girl whimpered behind Colton, and he could feel her small hands clutching desperately at his coat. She might not understand English, but she understood the tone, the chilling malice in Victor's voice. She knew, with chilling certainty, what awaited her if these men took her back. "You see, friend," Victor continued, his voice almost conversational, "this little flower here was destined for a very particular gentleman in San Francisco, a man with specific tastes. The barcode ensures authenticity, proves she's been properly processed through my organization. She's worth more than you'll make in 5 years. One of Victor's men, a hulking brute with several teeth missing, grumbled, "Boss, we're burning daylight. Just take her and let's go." But Victor held up a hand, silencing him. "Patience, Briggs. I'm trying to educate our cowboy friend here about the realities of business." He turned back to Colton, his eyes glittering with a cruel amusement. "You seem like a reasonable man. Walk away now, and there's no trouble between us. Hell, I might even throw you a few coins for your discretion." Colton felt the girl's grip tighten on his coat, those desperate, broken whispers forming the single word, "Please," repeated over and over in her own language. This young woman, barely more than a child, was begging him to save her from a fate worse than death, a fate that lingered in the shadows of those haunted eyes. "And if I refuse?" Colton asked, his voice dangerously low. Victor's smile vanished completely, replaced by an expression of cold, calculated menace. "Then you'll discover why they call me the brand, and trust me, cowboy, I don't limit my artwork to the merchandise." The threat hung in the air like the oppressive heat of the sun. Colton realized he wasn't just facing common criminals. He was looking at men who had systematically stripped away every vestige of humanity in their relentless pursuit of profit. They saw the girl behind him not as a living, breathing human being, but as an object, a commodity to be bought, sold, and used until she was broken beyond repair. But something else was becoming chillingly clear. The careful manner in which Victor spoke, the expensive clothes, the official-looking papers. This wasn't some small-time operation. This was organized, systematic, and likely reached much further than anyone realized. The question now wasn't just whether Colton could stand against it, but whether he was brave enough to. Colton's hand instinctively moved towards his gun, but Victor was lightning fast. The scarred man's pistol materialized in his hand with terrifying speed. The cold black barrel pointed directly at Colton's chest. The two other riders had also drawn their weapons, forming a lethal triangle of death with nowhere to escape. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable," Victor said with mock disappointment. "But I can see you're the heroic type. How tiresome." The girl behind Colton began to tremble violently, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. She'd witnessed this scene before, the moment when someone who dared to help her paid the ultimate price for their compassion. In broken English, she whispered, "No, please, no more dead." Victor's eyebrows arched with a disturbing curiosity. "Ah, she speaks. Good. I was beginning to worry the trauma had damaged her completely." He kept his gun trained on Colton while addressing the girl directly. "Tell your knight in shining armor what happened to the last man who tried to play the hero, little flower." The girl's whisper dissolved into a sob. He burn him. Make me watch. Say this happened to anyone who interferes with my business." Victor finished coldly. A ranch hand named Murphy. Sweet boy, really thought he could hide her in his barn. Victor's smile returned, even more terrible than before. "I made sure she understood that his death was entirely her fault. Quite educational for her training." Rage, raw and untamed, began to simmer in Colton's chest, building like a furnace stoked with hatred. This monster hadn't just branded the girl, he'd forced her to watch innocent people die because of her, weaving a tapestry of psychological torture as calculated as the physical marking. "She's not property," Colton said through gritted teeth, his voice a low growl. "Oh, but she is," Victor replied, reaching into his other pocket. He pulled out more papers, bills of sale, transport documents, all bearing official seals that reeked of corruption and complicity. "Purchased legally in San Francisco from a man who owed me considerable money, his daughter, as payment for debts. All quite above board, I assure you." The truth struck Colton like a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was a father selling his own child to settle gambling debts. A betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. The depth of the girl's suffering was almost unbearable. "The barcode," Victor continued conversationally, seemingly enjoying Colton's growing horror, "is my own innovation. Each girl gets a unique identifier, makes tracking much easier when they try to run. This one is 47B7, which means she's the 7th girl in batch 47, reserved for special clients. The B indicates she's been broken in properly." The girl made a strangled sound, like a wounded animal caught in a trap. Whatever broken in meant, the memory of it was consuming her from the inside out, leaving her hollow and shattered. Briggs, the heavy-set gunman, was growing increasingly impatient. "Boss, we need to move. If we're spotted here." "Yes, you're right," Victor said, his smile hardening. He cocked his pistol, the click echoing in the sudden silence. "Mr. Cowboy, you have exactly 5 seconds to step aside. After that, I'll kill you and take the girl anyway. Your heroism will accomplish nothing except adding another corpse to this canyon." Colton's mind raced, desperately searching for a solution. 3 armed men, all with guns drawn and nothing to lose. The girl was injured and unable to run. His horse was 20 yards away, too far to reach in time. The rocks offered some cover, but not enough to protect them both. 1, Victor began counting, his eyes glittering with sadistic anticipation. The girl clutched Colton's arm with surprising strength. "Run!" she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "Save yourself. I already broken 2. But Colton didn't move. He couldn't abandon her, not after learning what she'd already endured, not after seeing that barcode burned into her flesh like she was nothing more than a piece of merchandise. 3. That's when Colton noticed something Victor hadn't seen. Behind the rocks where the girl had been hiding, there was a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, a crack in the earth that offered a sliver of hope. It was barely wide enough for one person, but it appeared to lead up and away from the canyon floor, a potential escape route hidden in plain sight. 4, if they could reach it. But Victor's finger was already tightening on the trigger, the moment of truth hanging in the balance. Colton dove backward, throwing himself to the ground just as Victor's gun exploded with a deafening roar. The bullet shattered rock where his head had been a heartbeat before, sending a shower of deadly fragments into the air. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the girl around the waist and rolled towards the crevice, using the boulders as meager cover. "Kill them both!" Victor roared, his voice laced with fury. "But keep her face intact. She's worth less with a ruined face." Gunfire erupted from 3 directions, a storm of bullets ricocheting off the stone and sending razor-sharp fragments whizzing through the air. Colton felt a searing pain graze his shoulder as he pushed the girl toward the narrow opening in the canyon wall. "Can you climb?" he shouted over the cacophony of gunfire. She nodded frantically, her dark eyes wide with terror but also something else, a flicker of hope. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked like she dared to believe that escape might be possible. The crevice was even tighter than it had appeared from a distance. Colton had to turn sideways to squeeze through, the rough stone scraping against his back and chest, tearing at his clothes. Behind them, he could hear Victor's men cursing as they realized their quarry had found a way out. "Briggs, take the horses around to the north ridge," Victor's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Murphy, climb up after them. I want that girl back and I want the cowboy's head on a silver platter." The passage twisted upwards like a claustrophobic chimney, and Colton found himself pushing the girl ahead of him, his hands on her waist to help boost her up the steeper sections. Her injured leg was slowing them down, but she bit back any sounds of pain, knowing that even a whimper could betray their position. 20 feet up, the passage opened into a small, cramped cave, barely larger than a coffin. The girl collapsed immediately, her strength finally giving out after the adrenaline surge subsided. In the dim light filtering from the crevice, Colton could see her injury more clearly, a deep gash in her thigh that was still bleeding freely. She'd been running on pure adrenaline, fueled by a desperate will to survive. "We can't stop here," he whispered urgently, tearing strips from his already tattered shirt to bind her wound and stem the bleeding. "They'll find this passage soon enough." As if to underscore his point, they heard scrabbling sounds from below, someone attempting to follow them up the treacherous crevice. The girl gripped his arm with desperate strength, her nails digging into his flesh. "Please," she said in her broken English, her voice trembling. "Not let them take me back. I tell you secret. Morrison have more girls, many more in big house near the river. She struggled with the English words. "They make us practice for the men who buy us." Colton's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just about one girl escaping. Victor was running a systematic factory of human misery, churning out victims for the depraved appetites of the wealthy and powerful. "How many?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. 20, maybe more, all marked like me." She touched the barcode on her forehead with trembling fingers, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Some young as 12. Morrison, he say we are investment. Train us, then sell to rich men in big cities." The sounds from below were getting closer, more distinct. Someone had definitely found the passage and was relentlessly climbing up. They had mere minutes, perhaps seconds, before they were discovered. "There's another way out," the girl whispered, pointing to the back of the cave with a trembling hand. "I hide here before, passage goes up to canyon rim." But as Colton helped her to her feet, she suddenly gasped and pointed past him towards the cave entrance. A man's head had appeared at the opening. Murphy, Victor's other gunman, his face contorted in a predatory grin. His eyes met theirs across the narrow space, and his mouth opened to shout a warning to his boss below. Colton lunged forward with a primal roar, tackling the man before he could utter a sound. They grappled at the edge of the drop, Murphy's gun skittering across the cave floor and disappearing into the darkness. The outlaw was stronger than he appeared, his calloused hands closing around Colton's throat with crushing force. The girl, despite her injury, instinctively grabbed Murphy's dropped pistol, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she pointed it at the struggling men. But she couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting Colton. Murphy's grip tightened, cutting off Colton's air supply, black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. In a desperate surge of adrenaline, he drove his knee upwards with all his remaining strength, connecting with something soft and vulnerable. Murphy's grip loosened just enough for Colton to break free, gasping for air. But the damage was done. Murphy's struggles had been loud enough to alert the others below. "Up!" Victor's voice boomed from below, echoing through the narrow passage. "They're in the cave." More gunshots rang out, the confined space amplifying the deafening noise. Bullets pinged off the cave ceiling and walls, sending rock chips raining down like deadly hail. "The back passage!" Colton gasped, grabbing the girl's hand and pulling her towards the rear of the cave. "Now!" But as they stumbled towards the rear of the cave, the girl suddenly stopped, her body rigid with shock. Her face had gone pale, and she was staring at something in Murphy's coat that had been revealed during their frantic fight. A revelation that seemed to paralyze her. "What is it?" Colton demanded, his voice raw with urgency. She reached out with a trembling hand and pulled a small photograph from Murphy's pocket, her fingers brushing against the image with hesitant reverence. Even in the dim light, Colton could see it showed a young Chinese girl, younger than the one beside him, her face framed by braids. This was someone else, someone younger. "My sister," the girl whispered, her voice breaking, her eyes blurring with tears. "Mayan, she only 14. The photograph wasn't just a picture, a simple memento. It was a catalog image, complete with meticulous measurements and a chilling price written on the back. A dollar figure quantifying her value as a commodity. In that instant, if you were Colton, what would you do? Press on, risking everything to save one girl who might actually escape, or stay and fight, diverting his attention to rescue 20 others, knowing that Mayan's fate also hung in the balance. Colton saw the devastation in the girl's eyes as she stared at her sister's photograph. In that moment, he understood that escape alone would never be enough. Even if they made it out alive, she would spend the rest of her life haunted by the knowledge that Mayan and 20 other girls remained trapped in Victor's nightmare, their futures stolen, their humanity extinguished. "Where is this house?" he asked urgently, as bullets continued to ricochet around the cave, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. "Our ride east," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the echoes of gunfire. "By the bend in Snake River, big wooden house with high fence, guards always watching." More shouts echoed from below. Victor had arrived at the base of the crevice himself, and his rage was palpable even from their height, vibrating through the very stone of the canyon. "Leeway!" he roared, somehow knowing her name, his voice a chilling promise of retribution. "I know you can hear me. Come down now and I'll only punish you. Make me climb up there and I'll burn you like I burned the others who tried to run." The girl, Leeway, shuddered violently at the sound of her name, the sound itself a brand seared into her memory. "He killed them all if we escape," she said brokenly, her eyes filled with a bleak resignation. "Always punish the others when one runs. Make example." Colton felt the crushing weight of 20 lives settling on his shoulders, a burden he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about saving one girl anymore. It was about striking a blow against a monster who viewed human beings as nothing more than merchandise, a cancer that threatened to consume the very soul of the territory. "The passage," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Show me the passage." They squeezed through the rear opening, which led to another narrow chimney carved by the relentless forces of ancient water, a vertical tunnel that offered both salvation and a perilous descent into the unknown. As they climbed, Leeway told him more about Morrison's ruthless operation, painting a picture of calculated cruelty and systematic abuse. The girls were kept in a converted barn behind the main house, chained at night but allowed to move freely during the day within the fenced compound, their movements constantly monitored by watchful eyes. They were fed regularly, kept clean, and rigorously trained in various skills that would make them more valuable to potential buyers, their identities slowly eroded and replaced by a hollow obedience. "Few guards during day," she whispered as they climbed, her voice strained with exertion and fear. "But at night only 2 men watched the barn, others drink in main house. When they finally emerged at the canyon rim, the sun was beginning its final descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red. They had perhaps 4 hours of daylight left, a shrinking window of opportunity to confront an evil that thrived in the shadows. Colton's horse was still down in the canyon along with his rifle and essential supplies, a painful reminder of their vulnerability. "We need weapons," he said, surveying the empty, unforgiving landscape around them, searching for any sign of salvation. Li-Wei reached into her torn dress and pulled out a small, worn knife, barely more than a letter opener, but honed to a razor-sharp edge. "I take from house when I run, not much." But then a sound pierced the silence, making them both freeze in their tracks. The unmistakable thunder of horses' hooves approaching with relentless speed from the north, accompanied by the harsh voices of men shouting orders. Victor's men had found another way up to the canyon rim, closing the net around them. Briggs's gruff voice carried across the rocky terrain, amplified by the vastness of the landscape. "2 figures by the cliff edge. I see them." Colton grabbed Li-Wei's hand and they ran, their hope dwindling with every stride. The riders were gaining on them quickly, and there was nowhere to hide on the exposed canyon rim, no shelter from the storm that was about to break. That's when Colton spotted something that changed everything, a flicker of hope in the fading light. A tendril of smoke rising lazily from behind a cluster of rocks about half a mile away, a fragile signal in the wilderness. Someone else was out here, a potential ally or an even greater threat lurking in the shadows. As they limped towards the smoke, praying that it signified salvation and not more danger, Li-Wei suddenly gripped his arm with painful intensity, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning realization. "I remember something," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the pounding of their hearts and the approaching thunder of hooves. "Morrison, he say something about big shipment coming tomorrow night. Many buyers coming from far cities. He planning to sell all girls at once." The implications of her words hit Colton with the force of a physical blow. Tomorrow night, Li-Wei's sister and all the other girls would be scattered to buyers across the territory, disappearing into a darkness from which there was no return. Some would end up in the gilded cages of San Francisco's pleasure houses, their spirits broken beyond repair. Others would be relegated to the private collections of wealthy men who viewed them as nothing more than exotic toys, their humanity stripped away and replaced with an objectified silence. After tomorrow night, they would vanish forever, lost in a labyrinth of depravity where no one would ever think to look for them. The smoke was closer now, and Colton could make out a small camp hidden among the rocks, but as they cautiously approached, he realized their problems had just multiplied exponentially. The camp belonged to a group of men he recognized instantly from faded and dog-eared wanted posters tacked up in saloons and sheriff's offices. The Dutton Gang, a band of notorious outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory for months, leaving a trail of robberies, bloodshed, and broken promises in their wake. Behind them, Victor's riders were closing in fast, their relentless pursuit a suffocating presence. Ahead lay a group of hardened criminals who would likely kill them both for sport, their moral compasses long since shattered, and somewhere to the east, 20 young girls waited in silent terror for a rescue that seemed increasingly impossible. The Dutton Gang looked up from their card game as Colton and Li-Wei stumbled into their camp, their faces etched with exhaustion and desperation. 5 men, all hardened by the unforgiving realities of the frontier, their eyes holding the cold glint of those who had seen too much violence and committed too many sins. Their leader, a grizzled man with a scarred face and a graying beard that spoke of years spent battling the elements and evading the law, slowly reached for his gun, his movements betraying a practiced lethality. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice rough as gravel. "What do we have here?" He paused, his eyes raking over Li-Wei with a calculating gaze. "A cowboy and his little China doll?" Colton raised his hand slowly, keeping Li-Wei safely behind him, shielding her from their predatory stares. "We're just passing through," he said, his voice even and controlled, despite the tremor of fear that ran through him. "We don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" The gang leader laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that sent a shiver down Colton's spine. trouble. Mister, you just brought trouble right to our doorstep. See, we've been watching those riders chasing you, saw the whole showdown in the canyon through our spyglass. Figured it was only a matter of time before you stumbled into our little hideaway." One of the other outlaws, a young man with nervous eyes and a perpetually twitching trigger finger, spoke up hesitantly. "Boss, those are Morrison's men. We don't want to get crossways with him. He's got friends in high places."
"Shut up, Tommy,"
the leader snapped, silencing the younger outlaw with a withering glare. Then he turned back to Colton, his eyes glinting with a mixture of greed and something else, something that hinted at a hidden agenda. "Name's Ezra Dutton, and you, friend, are about to make me a very rich man." The thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, the relentless pursuit closing in. Victor's men would be here within minutes, and the fragile truce between Colton and the outlaws threatened to shatter at any moment. "You see," Dutton continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "Morrison's put quite a bounty on runaway merchandise. $500 for the girl, dead or alive. Another 100 for anyone helping her escape." His smile was predatory, revealing teeth stained brown from years of chewing tobacco. "That's more than we'd make robbing stagecoaches for 6 months." Leeway pressed closer to Colton, her small knife clutched tightly in her hand, a weapon that seemed pathetically inadequate against 5 armed men, but a symbol of her unwavering determination to survive. "But here's what's interesting," Dutton went on, his voice taking on a sardonic edge. "Morrison's little operation has been cutting into our business hard. It's getting harder and harder to rob travelers when half of them are his merchandise handlers, carrying official-looking papers and bribing every lawman in the territory. Makes us look like common thieves instead of the freedom fighters we fancy ourselves to be." Colton caught something in the outlaw's tone, something that transcended mere greed, a flicker of genuine resentment towards Victor's organization, and the way it had disrupted the established order of the criminal underworld. "You're saying Morrison's been bad for your business?" Colton asked carefully, seizing on the opportunity to exploit the simmering conflict between the two factions. "Damn right. He's been bad for business. His people have safe passage through our territory because everyone's too scared to cross him. Meanwhile, we're scraping by on what little honest criminals are left." Dutton spat into the dirt, his face contorted in a mask of disgust. "The man's got no respect for traditional outlawing. He's turning the whole damn territory into his own private plantation." The hoofbeats were very close now, the pounding rhythm filling the air with a sense of impending doom. Leeway tugged urgently at Colton's sleeve, pointing to a ridge overlooking the camp where 3 riders had just appeared, silhouetted against the setting sun. Victor, Briggs, and Murphy, their faces etched with anger and frustration.
"There they are!"
Victor's voice carried across the distance, amplified by the still air. "Dutton, I know you're there. Send out my property and there'll be gold in it for you." Ezra Dutton's expression darkened at being ordered around like a common lackey. "Your property?" he called back, his voice laced with defiance. "Last time I checked, this was my territory, and I don't take orders from lily-livered city slickers. Don't be a fool, Ezra." Victor rode closer, his gun drawn but not yet aimed, his face a mask of controlled fury. "The girl is worth more to me than whatever you think you can get for her. Name your price and I'll double it." Dutton looked from Victor to Leeway, his mind clearly calculating the potential benefits of each course of action. Then his eyes fell on the barcode burned into her forehead, a symbol of dehumanization that seemed to ignite something within him, a spark of long-dormant conscience. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They actually branded her like livestock?" For all their crimes, the Dutton gang were still Americans, men who had fought in wars and buried friends, who had witnessed the best and worst of humanity. The sight of a young woman marked like cattle struck something deep within them, a chord that resonated with their own sense of right and wrong. "Boss," Tommy said quietly, his voice unusually somber. "My sister's about her age." Victor was growing increasingly impatient, his carefully constructed facade of civility beginning to crumble under the weight of his barely suppressed rage. "Dutton, I'm offering you $1,000, he shouted, his voice laced with desperation. "More money than you've seen in years. This is your chance to change your lives, to escape this God-forsaken territory and start over somewhere new. Don't throw it all away for some sentimental impulse." But Ezra Dutton was no longer listening, his gaze fixed on Leeway, his eyes filled with something approaching horror. "How many more like her?" he asked Colton, his voice a low growl, barely audible above the rustling wind. 20 in his compound, some as young as 12. The outlaw leader's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "And they're all marked? All being sold off to buyers tomorrow night like cattle?" Dutton looked at his men, seeing his own revulsion reflected in their faces. These were hard men who had killed and stolen without remorse, men who had lived by their own rules, but there were lines even they wouldn't cross, boundaries they wouldn't violate, even for $1,000. "Tommy," Dutton said quietly, his voice laced with a dangerous calm, "remember what those Union soldiers did to your farm during the war? How they treated your ma and sister? Remember what it felt like to be helpless, to watch them take everything you held dear?" The young outlaw's face went pale with the vivid memory of that long-ago trauma, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "Boss, this is different. This is worse," Dutton finished, his voice hardening with resolve. "This is buying and selling American girls like they're horses, treating them like nothing more than property, and I ain't about to stand by and let that happen." Victor's patience finally snapped, his face contorted into a mask of unbridled rage. "Enough talk. Stand aside, Dutton, and hand over the girl, or I'll take her by force. Don't think for a second that I'm afraid of you and your band of misfits." Dutton slowly stood up, his hand resting casually on the handle of his gun, his eyes locked on Victor's with an unwavering intensity. His 4 men followed suit, forming a solid line between Victor's riders and the camp, a fragile barrier between justice and depravity. "You know what, Morrison?" Dutton called out, his voice resonating with a newfound sense of purpose. "I think I'll keep the girl. Might even pay your little compound a visit tomorrow night. See what other interesting merchandise you've been hoarding. I reckon the good people of this territory would be interested to learn about your little enterprise." The threat was clear, and Victor's face went white with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Dutton. You're making a mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your short life." "Sure I do," the outlaw replied calmly, his eyes gleaming with a cold resolve. "I'm dealing with a man who brands children like cattle and sells them to the highest bidder, a man who profits from the suffering of others. And where I come from, we have a special way of dealing with men like that." But even as the confrontation escalated and the tension in the air reached a breaking point, Colton noticed something that chilled his blood. Victor wasn't looking worried anymore, despite the overwhelming odds, despite the defiance of the outlaws. He was smiling, and from the eastern horizon, a cloud of dust was rapidly approaching, a harbinger of reinforcements. More riders moving fast, their numbers significantly tipping the scales in Victor's favor. Victor had called for backup, and the cavalry was on its way. The approaching dust cloud quickly resolved itself into a force of 12 riders, all wearing the same type of fine clothes as Victor, but carrying an array of military-grade weapons that spoke of deadly efficiency. These weren't just hired guns or common thugs. They were Victor's enforcers, a well-trained and heavily armed private army that protected his human trafficking empire with ruthless efficiency. "Gentlemen," Victor called out with renewed confidence, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I'd like you to meet my associates. They handle disputes like this on a daily basis. I'm sure they'll be happy to explain to you the error of your ways." Ezra Dutton's face went grim as he counted the approaching riders, his hopes of a peaceful resolution quickly evaporating. His gang was outnumbered 3-1, and these weren't ordinary opponents, but seasoned killers who had likely seen more combat than he cared to imagine. But despite the overwhelming odds, something had hardened in the outlaw leader's eyes, a resolve that spoke of lines that couldn't be uncrossed, of a moral compass that, however tarnished, still pointed true. "Tommy," Dutton said quietly, his voice barely audible above the approaching thunder of hooves. "Take the girl and the cowboy to the horses. Get them out of here, now." "Boss, we're not leaving you," Tommy protested, his face filled with concern for his comrades. "That's an order," Dutton snapped, his voice leaving no room for argument. Someone needs to get word out about what Morrison's really doing. Can't do that if we're all dead. The sound of horses fades slightly. A gentle acoustic guitar begins to play softly. So what started as a simple tracking job for Colton spiraled into something far bigger, didn't it? It became a fight for justice, a stand against unimaginable cruelty, and a desperate gamble to save not just one life, but many. The main message here, I think, is that even in the darkest corners of the world, even when faced with overwhelming odds, one person's choice to stand up against evil can ignite a chain reaction, inspiring others to do the same. It shows us that our humanity lies not just in our safety, but in our willingness to risk it all for what's right. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts on Colton's decisions, the moral dilemmas he faced, and the choices that Dutton made. Did he make the right choices? What would you have done in his situation? Leave a comment below. I'm really curious to hear your perspective and continue the conversation. I really enjoyed this story and the characters created. And if you enjoyed this story and want to delve into more tales of courage, resilience, and the fight for what's right, hit that subscribe button. That way you won't miss out on any future stories we uncover together. Thank you so much for watching.